Okay, perfect. So I can start with the first question.
Okay.
So tell me a little bit about yourself and your background and what is your story essentially?
Okay, so I was an alderman in the city of Chicago for 24 years. I left the city council. I retired 11 years ago. Before that, I was a community activist. I came to Chicago actually in 1972, so quite a while ago, maybe 40 years, huh? To join a group called the Intercommunal Survival Committee. We were a cadre of white people organizing white people to join the Black-led struggle for liberation, and we worked under the direction of the Black Panther Party. That was in 1972. You couldn't be in Chicago and do any kind of organizing at that time um, without being confronted left and right, really, by the machine, which was very different than what people refer to today. It was the old man Daley, the father, was mayor, and he built a very strong machine based on patronage and political power, and he pretty much controlled most institutions, and the status quo was firmly in place in the midst of a country where there was huge changes in the making in the 70s and a lot of opposition, obviously, to the war in Vietnam, following and continuing through an increasingly strong civil rights movement and effective civil rights movement. But in all of those instances and all of the things that we were doing, what was clear was, and especially if you look back on it today, there's a lot of things that have changed and a lot of things that haven't changed so much. But all of the changes, including all of the reaction to the changes, have been successful because large numbers of ordinary people organized to do pretty much extraordinary things, to do things that were out of the normal course of things, outside of the status quo, constantly pushing the envelope to make change. But that came about collectively, and it came about over time, after a struggle. We used to say it takes quantitative change to lead to qualitative change. So, you don't change someone's mind overnight. You don't change the way things are going overnight. It's really bite by bite, or shovelful by shovelful, or however you want to think about it, one step at a time. You have to go to A to B. You can't just jump ahead to Z if you're trying to make something happen. So that's kind of my foundation, and it's what I've done since then. In the last 10 years, and especially the last few. So when I left the city council, I spent a lot of time helping my son, who was a civil rights attorney, to sort of put systems into his law firm, and then to create a new office for them that also became a center on the west side of Chicago called the West Side Center for Justice. And there's now multiple civil rights, social justice organizations there who've all been very impactful in making changes in the bail system, in presentation at the legal presentation in police departments, a bunch of stuff like that. So now during the pandemic, I just very frustrated by the world in which we find ourselves and the political dynamic, which is not that different than the one that I always faced in Chicago, but which has gotten crazier and national and international, and it's frightening, and to me very reminiscent of history in the world previously that led to fascism and Nazi Germany, and it's a great concern to me that we can easily be repeating history because so little of it is taught, and so few of us actually still know it. So I decided it was time to get serious about writing a book, which I've been talking about with friends, or people have been pushing me to do for years. So that's what I did during the pandemic, and that'll be coming out in the fall. And I think it's really the most important piece of it for me is I tried to write personal stories in a way that was very readable, and that would in themselves tell the story and provide some insight into what we learned or didn't learn, both positive and negative, that could be helpful to people today. But the bottom line for me is that if you that we have to be serious about change these days. We have to be serious about those things that are not opportunistic and not short ranged, but that really allow us to be able to impact policies so that they have a positive material impact on people's day-to-day struggle to survive in their lives, and creates the possibility for a real future for our kids and our grandkids, because currently that's pretty insecure. And so I think in order to do that, you need to create a sea for policymakers to swim in, that pushes the envelope and that can hold accountable our friends and give them support, those who are really just need that help in order to be effective, and create a momentum that will bring other people along who currently aren't tended to do so, who currently don't tend to do so. So that's kind of who I am.
Cool, thank you so much. Next question. How do you think the intersectionality between race and gender affects the struggle for gender equality?
Well, I think that I do believe if you're going to solve, in order to solve any problem, you have to address it from the point of its most serious manifestation. You have to, and then you have to do so in a manner that allows you to also be aware of, the impacts and the ripples outside of that, the collateral impacts. But you have to start at its most serious impact and from the perspective and point of view of those most affected. And then you can begin to look, once you do that at the core, you can then see what your solutions and your ideas, the best ones that then positively as well affect the next string of people and the next, et cetera. So I believe that it's been my experience that is true if you're in almost any circumstance addressing any problem. And if you apply that to your question, I would say they're inextricably related, and that, but you cannot do anything unless you address the issue of the color line and race. You can't. You're not going to have a real solution. And our country is the best example of that, because we started out in the founding of the Constitution. There were the only people that were really full citizens were white men with money, and it's taken a great deal to increase the umbrella that provides protections for people and considers all people full citizens. But the basis of our Constitution created as the basis of our economy legally in the Constitution slavery, and therefore inequality from the very beginning. And unless we recognize the legacy of that and are open to addressing that, we can't solve any of the other issues, including the fact that women were excluded, because the fact of slavery overrode all of that. So that it's true that there is inequality when it comes to between men and women, but it's even more true that the legacy of slavery has impacted the trajectory of people's lives from the very beginning, and are still affecting it today in terms of how our institutions function. So it affects women, but it affects more severely women of color.
Yeah, thank you. So in your political career, have you had any?
I'm sorry, but also women of low economic standing, because the one thing that was not protected in the Constitution and actually excluded was any discrimination based on economics. Just important to know, because we think, we're a country where everyone has equal rights. You don't have equal rights if there's so many ways in which you don't have equal rights, or which people have had to fight for those rights. And if you fought for them and succeeded, what we've learned in the last few months is that they can still be taken away.
Yeah, thank you. So
I'm sorry, but what just occurred to me, it's not just that they can be taken away, but they're being taken away by people who are saying we have to go back to the original Constitution, which in its essence made sure that only white men with money had rights. And since we don't have civics anymore in our classes, and we don't study the Constitution, and we don't study from the beginning through all of its changes to the present, we're really left without the tools we need to do proper critical thinking. Sorry.
No, it's totally fine. Thank you for that. Yeah, so in your political career, have you had any experiences with gender inequality?
Sure. One of my first experiences in the city council was being pinched on my butt by a fellow city council member. But also just the assumption I had to, the likelihood that I would be ridiculed was a constant dynamic. And there were diminutive words that were used to greet me by members of the city council, especially when I was first elected. I was elected as I became Harold Washington's 26th vote. And that was important at the time, for those who don't know the history, because when he was elected, there was opposition, organized 29 aldermen to vote against, out of 50, to vote against everything that he wanted to do. In spite of that, he was successful at about 94% of city business and getting it done, but they really held up the appointments to boards and commissions that were really critical to people's everyday life and really needed to be changed, and couldn't be unless the board members were changed. There was a special election held in a number of wards into the third year into his first term, and as court ordered, and as a result of that, there was a 25-25 split on the city council, which allowed him to be able to make these appointments because he could be the 26th vote to break the tie. But to really be effective, it was tough. He had to have everyone in the city council, everyone had to come to a meeting. So to be effective, he really needed that 26th vote. I became that vote, and initially, that was, so I was part of his team. As soon as he died, the old opposition sort of reared its head again, and towards me, they were very, what's the word? Paternalistic, and often used diminutive words, like Aldi or whatever, to greet me and to respond to me as a way, I think, to show disrespect, although it acted, on the one hand, it appeared to be a term of endearment, but really it was one of disrespect. In addition to that, there was always an attempt to ridicule me whenever I was trying to present a new idea, which was like always, or ask questions and to probe into something more deeply in a city council meeting or hearing. And what I came to realize very quickly was that I had a mantra: no question is a stupid question, and just keep going. Keep your head, just keep going forward. Look them in the eye. Know that no question is a stupid question. Let it go out, run down your back, which wasn't so easy, and just keep going and ask your question, do your thing, make your statement. But it was, there was definitely a challenge. And early on, there was a lot of domestic violence in the city that wasn't being addressed, a lot of sexual harassment. So So Harold died 7 months into his first term. There was a temporary, Eugene Sawyer became the alderman for a year and a half. There was a special election, and Rich Daley won that election, and he became the mayor. And that was 1989. And almost immediately, I took advantage of the situation. And anyway, politics is like playing a game of chess. So I played a little game of chess, and got a subcommittee established under the Committee for Human Rights. And it was a subcommittee on domestic violence. And they all laughed at me, but they said, oh, that's harmless, whatever. And I decided that I was going to do it a little differently, and that I was going to invite all of the people, all the organizations in the city that were both formal and informal, that were addressing domestic violence, to be part of the subcommittee. And I demanded that the police department send a representative to our meetings, because they were integral to how people were responding to this. So we ended up with quite a number of people coming regularly to the subcommittee, very few aldermen, if any. But it allowed me to put together hearings and to address a series of things, but to raise the question of respect, to demand and have a formal way to demand changes in the level of respect for women in the city of Chicago. And we were starting with domestic violence. So it was corresponded to Bill Clinton was the president of the United States, and he did he did that big crime bill, but in it, that has been very criticized, but within it was a lot of money that went to locally to the police departments, but there was a bunch of it that was targeted to domestic violence. So I was able to force that issue effectively and to actually get some resources there. So we were actually able to get some programs. And one of my best stories, this is a total aside, but I think it answers part of your question, was that I really had been trying hard to get a program funded that would allow women who who were victims of domestic violence, who had children, and were ordered by the court to allow their spouse who had been violent against them to be able to visit with their children. And we wanted a program that provided a safe way to do that, so that there would always be somebody, a third party there. And that so that the women didn't have to be afraid of additional violence or of somehow something happening with their children and being kidnapped or whatever. So, and they were absolutely everybody, the majority city council at that point, which was, I was an independent alderman at that point after Harold died, and the administration was just totally ignoring my pleas. So we're in the budget hearings. It's the last day of budget hearings, and the police department is the last department. And they come, and I'm really pushing it with them because it's this money that I wanted is money that was allocated to their department. And I'd been asking for it and talking to people and getting, just blank stares, just no response. I was being ghosted. So the superintendent comes up, and he's surrounded by all these big white guys who are totally uninterested and immediately sit down and start chatting while I'm asking questions behind the superintendent, just chatting. I can't even hear his response. I doubt he could hear my questions. And I'm going through my regular set of questions, and then I get to the ones about domestic violence. I don't even remember actually. And maybe the domestic violence money wasn't actually coming from them, but they've been part of the discussion. At any rate, the point is, I'm feeling really disrespected, and I'm exhausted. It's the end of 2 weeks. I have been every night that for the last 2 weeks, I've studied well into the night. I haven't slept more than 2 hours a night. I've been sitting through all these hearings. It's like 6 or 7 o'clock at night. We've been working all day long. They're completely disrespecting me. And I burst into tears. I have no control, and I burst into tears. This was not planned. Immediately, the chief of staff for the chairman of the committee walks all the way around the room, because I'm in the back, comes to me, kneels down by me and says, "How does $200,000 sound for your for your program?" And I said, "That sounds perfect. Thank you very much." I mean, everyone is like silent. They don't know what to do. And then he comes and does that. And I joked about it afterwards. It was like I had to cry in front of the council. So, my point was, okay, so sometimes it's all right to cry. But that was actually, I was there, I was the image of the woman that they were like trying to project on me on the one hand, but on the other hand, I was being relentless, and they didn't know what to do with that. And it ended up resulting in getting a really important program funded. So I think it's a good story and a lesson of some sorts. It wouldn't have worked if I had planned it. But it was a very honest expression that ended up getting a result. But it was a very clear example of the times.
Yeah, thank you. How do you think the political atmosphere can be changed to promote gender equality?
Step by step, by people demanding and fighting for it. I think that there's huge changes. I mean, in many ways, it's a different world from when I was younger. And there's so many different aspects to it. But I think, if you look at all the different things that affect, so many things affect women. Equal pay clearly affects women. The ability to have childcare clearly affects women. The healthcare clearly affects women and everything related to it, whether it's abortion or just plain. I was talking to my niece today, who has an 8-month-old baby, who I met for the first time, and she was talking about the birth. and how the doctor initially, she was in a labor for a little bit of time. It was her first baby, and the doctor, and she was completely healthy. It had no problems at all throughout her entire pregnancy, and it wasn't happening fast enough. So they wanted to do a C-section, and she said, "What? No, no way." And so the next doctor that came in told her, and this was a woman, said, "I hear you were very uncooperative." She said, "I wasn't uncooperative. I was just trying to control my own body." And she said, "Well, I think we should break your water." And she said, "Hell no, this is going to be a natural childbirth." But I think that's last year, and a really good example of the lack of respect for women. So there's a lot of ways in which that's shown. On the other hand, she held her ground. And I think it's really important for women to know that they can. She was in a situation that not only did she know and had been supported enough in her lifetime that she knew she could hold her ground, and she had a good sense of herself, but and she had some people around who were not intimidated by the doctors, who respected her decision and encouraged her and gave her support. But it was, really tough. And in the end, she had to stand up herself. So I think it's important that we support women in that way, that women really need to support women in that way and need to get men to do it as well. That we really need to create that dynamic. It's a much better than when I was giving birth. But it is, I think that I gave birth to my son in Racine, Wisconsin, and I believe his dad was the first man ever to be present during a childbirth, and I insisted on it. He kind of freaked out when Brendan actually came out because, we really weren't prepared for what he was going to look like. We didn't really have the education. We had done we'd done Lamaze, we had done all sorts of stuff to be prepared for the childbirth, but we weren't prepared, and he certainly wasn't, for a cone head that looked purple, and he freaked out and they kicked him out of the delivery room. I don't think that would necessarily happen today, but I know today it's a commonplace. Not only for men to be in the emergency room during the birth, or whatever room it is, but also to actually have birthing rooms and for home births and so many different things. So there's a lot of changes, but there's a lot of things that still are really out there, and that where burdens fall on women in a situation where we're going backwards in terms of a respect for women being able to control their own lives and their own bodies. And I think the abortion attack and the attack against women's health is really about, you really are it's really a throwback to, you're just a vessel, you don't have control, and it represents kind of a very deep level of disrespect. So I think that it's very important to carry on the demand that women be respected. But also, I think, once again, that has to be done in the context of addressing the problem from its most serious manifestation, and in all the different ways in which it does manifest, because there's multiple examples of it. Those are just a few.
Yeah. So do you think gender equality is attainable in the United States, and why or why not?
Well, I wouldn't say just the United States. I think I think it's ultimately attainable anywhere, but it's not something that happens overnight. And I think it's something that we have to address every single day in the way we live our lives, and that it should be. And those things that affect us the most are really important struggles. So today, I think that that's clear in the context of, especially in the context of women's health care and a living wage. And I think that that's really, really critical, because if women can be independent economically, they are able to really contribute to that struggle, and they're able to live a fuller life, and therefore able to grow and raise children that are able to understand and respect and understand the needs, and be more respectful women, because we're creating a different society. So that's true for both of those instances, health and wealth. So I think that those are priorities. They come, I know a lot of people say the most important thing is to break the glass ceiling, and I respect that is helpful, but that can't come without the rest, because everyone else gets left behind. And no matter what people say about, if you get inside the system, you can change it, there's a little bit of truth to that. But ultimately, change comes from the passion that people have who are most affected. They're the guarantee that it comes from, that the direction of change will reflect their perspective in terms of their needs. It's not to say someone else cannot get it. anyone can, but who really knows their experience is the people experiencing it themselves. And whether they have a solution or not, they know what the issue is and they know what their problems are. Whether they believe that it's possible to change or not defines whether or not it's possible for them to really make the sacrifices necessary to be engaged in the struggle. And so that's what we have to address collectively and create the support to make that happen. But nothing happens overnight. It is really quantitative change really is what's needed to lead to qualitative change. And having that perspective is important to be able to day by day do what's necessary to build the dynamic or the sea, if you will, that allows and forces the sea change that will allow for the change.
Yeah.
It's not just a US problem though.
Yes, definitely. I agree. Why do you think it is important to fight for gender equality?
Because I'm a woman and I think that I can see, well, that's what brings me to it, but we're all human beings and we will not live in a world of justice without everybody receiving it. So that's a piece of that.
Yeah, thank you. And what do we as a society need to do to achieve gender equality?
I think I've answered that.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think you kind of already touched on that. So, lastly, is there just anything else you'd like to say?
Nope, I think I got it all.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna
You're welcome. So
wrap
what
it
are
up.
you doing with this? You're making